humid, relentless heat of the Mississippi Delta, the cotton fields stretched like an endless sea of green and white. It was 1851, and Nathaniel Rutled's plantation thrived on the backs of enslaved men and women, their labor extracted without mercy. Among them worked Caleb, a young man whose pale skin and ghostly hair set him apart from everyone else. From the moment he was sold from Haiti as a boy, he had been marked as different, not just by the color of his skin, but by the quiet intensity with which he observed the world. Caleb's story did not begin in Mississippi, nor even on the ships that carried him across the Gulf of Mexico. It began in the sun-drenched hills of Haiti, where his mother, herself a woman of mixed African and European ancestry, taught him the secret knowledge that would shape his life. She had been born free, but political upheaval had turned freedom into chains. From her, Caleb learned to read and write in secret, using a Bible she hid from the eyes of those who would punish her for such forbidden learning. She taught him about plants, their powers and dangers, about the human body, and about how illness could be treated or inflicted. But perhaps the most important lesson she imparted was about survival. Knowledge is power, she told him, her eyes dark with sorrow and determination. But for someone like you, marked as different, knowledge must be hidden. You must learn to apply it carefully, sparingly, and with patience. Your strength will come from understanding what others cannot. Your safety will come from foresight, from planning beyond what most men can imagine. Caleb's childhood was brief and marked by tragedy. At 17, his mother was killed by an overseer who had tried to assault her. In a desperate act of self-defense, she poisoned the man, paying the ultimate price with her life. Caleb was sold shortly afterward, beginning a journey through Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. Each transfer brought new masters, new cruelties, and new lessons in survival. He learned that quiet obedience invited escalating cruelty, that submission was a trap, and that only the cultivation of fear, subtle, intangible fear, could offer a margin of safety. It was this understanding that transformed Caleb from a frightened boy into a man of meticulous, almost preternatural calculation. He learned to move through life as a ghost, present but unseen, observing everything, missing nothing. He became a student of human behavior, studying patterns of cruelty and weakness, learning how small interventions could have outsized effect. And when the cruelty reached a point that could not be endured, he discovered that the human body could be influenced, even destroyed, using nothing more than nature's own tools. Caleb's mastery of poisons was not the work of impulse or passion. It was the work of patient observation and careful experimentation. He knew the properties of water hemlock, foxglove, pokeweed, and white snakeroot. He understood timing, dosage, and the subtle accumulation of compounds that could incapacitate or kill. Rutled, his master, was a cruel man whose whims were unpredictable, whose punishments were swift and brutal. Caleb recognized that direct confrontation was suicide, but that measured, indirect resistance offered the possibility of survival and retribution. For months he administered small, seemingly harmless doses of plant extracts to Rutled, using the guise of remedies intended to make him less cruel. The process was slow, meticulous. Caleb tracked the effects on Rutled's body with the precision of a scientist. Each symptom, each subtle change was noted and interpreted. He waited until the perfect moment, when Rutled's body would collapse under the final calculated blow, a moment orchestrated so that the death would appear natural, or at least inevitable. Caleb's journals reveal the depth of his understanding. He wrote not only of the plants themselves but of their pharmacokinetics, how the body absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted the compounds he administered. To Caleb, this was not supernatural power. It was applied science, born from necessity and honed through years of study and careful experimentation. Yet the act of planning and executing Rutled's death came at a personal cost. Caleb wrote of the hollowness that began to consume him. "I survived," he noted, "but I do not know if I truly lived. I became a ghost long before anyone called me that name. I hollowed myself out to survive, removed everything soft and vulnerable, transformed myself into an instrument of resistance and revenge." The words, neat and deliberate in the journal, reveal the quiet despair of a man who had sacrificed his humanity to endure in a system designed to crush both body and spirit. After Rutled's death in September 1850, under the cover of night he moved through swamps and forests, guided by the stars and by the knowledge of the terrain he had quietly accumulated. He made contact with conductors on the Underground Railroad, who helped him reach Canada. There, in the relative safety of freedom, he began to rebuild a life, although one forever altered by the experiences of his youth. In Canada, Caleb worked as an herbalist and an informal medical consultant, quietly helping those in need while continuing his private studies of medicine, chemistry and biology. He sought to understand not only what he had done but what he was capable of doing. "I needed to know," he wrote, "whether I had killed Rutled through some supernatural power or through simple application of natural substances. The answer was the latter. Knowledge, not magic, had been my weapon." Even in freedom, the shadow of his past lingered. Caleb never married, never formed lasting friendships, and lived largely in isolation. His journal entries from the later years describe a man who had survived unimaginable horrors, but at the cost of his emotional and social life. The price of resistance, it seemed, was the loss of the very humanity he had fought to preserve. Yet Caleb's story did not vanish with him. In 1947, nearly a century after his death, a package arrived anonymously at the Warren County Historical Society in Mississippi. Inside was a small leather-bound journal and a letter explaining its provenance. The sender, a descendant of one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad who had helped Caleb, revealed that the journal had been entrusted to his grandfather by Caleb himself, with instructions to preserve it until enough time had passed for it to be made public safely. The journal confirmed many details that local historians had only suspected. Caleb had indeed orchestrated Rutled's death using plant toxins. His methods were scientifically sound, even by 20th century. Soil samples from the plantation site preserved for decades later confirmed unusually high concentrations of the same compounds Caleb had described. Handwriting analysis and forensic studies verified the authenticity of the journal. Even medical historians were impressed by the sophistication of Caleb's pharmacological knowledge. The narrative, presented in the journal, and corroborated by evidence, challenged conventional assumptions about enslaved people's agents. Caleb was not a passive victim. He was an intelligent, observant and strategic actor, capable of transforming knowledge into power, even in circumstances designed to strip him of autonomy. His actions, while morally complex, reveal a capacity for resistance and survival that transcends the simplistic dichotomies of hero and villain. Descendants of enslaved people later came forward to share oral histories that corroborated Caleb's story, recounting tales of a pale, ghost-like figure whose subtle interventions caused fear among cruel masters. Marie Dawson, whose great-great-grandmother had lived on a nearby plantation, recounted, "The other plantation owners became cautious after what happened to Mr. Rutled. They improved the food slightly, became suspicious of their drinks, hired tasters. For a time they remembered that we were human, capable of thought and planning, not just property." Caleb's legacy then was not merely survival, it was the disruption of a system designed to annihilate the human spirit. Through careful, patient and methodical action, he demonstrated that even in the most oppressive conditions, enslaved people could exercise intelligence, agency, and strategic resistance. Yet the story also serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating the profound personal cost of such resistance. The system of slavery created monsters on both sides, the oppressors, shaped by entitlement and cruelty, and the oppressed, transformed into instruments of survival and vengeance. As the cotton fields reclaimed by nature and the Yazoo River continued to flow past the ruins of the Rutled plantation, the story of Caleb persisted, not as legend, not as ghost story, but as historical reality. A man who had harnessed knowledge to protect himself and strike back, who had endured beyond the ordinary limits of human endurance, and who had paid an incalculable price for resistance. Whether one sees him as hero or monster, freedom fighter or murderer, the story of Caleb forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It asks us to confront the realities of oppression and the impossible choices it imposes. It reminds us that the past is never simple, that history is full of moral complexity, and that the people we are taught to see as helpless victims were often anything but. They were observers, thinkers, planners, resistors, and sometimes instruments of calculated violence. And in that realization lies the haunting truth. Oppression does not merely victimize, it transforms, and resistance, even when justified, often leaves wounds that survive long after the chains are gone. Caleb's story is one of survival, intelligence and courage, but also of a humanity hollowed out in the service of survival, a ghost lingering in the soil and the stories of the Mississippi Delta, demanding to be remembered. After fleeing Mississippi under the cover of night, Caleb arrived in Canada with nothing but the clothes on his back, a small satchel of possessions, and the knowledge his mother had passed down to him. Canada was freedom in its most literal sense, yet for Caleb, Freedom came wrapped in isolation. He was free from the whips and chains of the American South, but he carried a weight no man could see, the calculated violence he had committed to survive. Freedom, he realized, was not simply the absence of a master, it was the presence of responsibility, of choices, and of the consequences that could never be escaped. Settling near the outskirts of Toronto, Caleb took up work as an herbalist, offering remedies quietly to those who sought them. He never advertised, preferring anonymity, but word spread among local communities of a pale man who could heal ailments conventional doctors could not. His remedies were meticulous, combining the observational skills he had honed under slavery with the theoretical understanding he continued to develop in his own studies. Caleb pored over books on medicine, chemistry, and biology, seeking to comprehend the human body and its vulnerability. In this self-education, he found both solace and obsession. Knowledge became both a shield and a mirror, reflecting what he had done and what he could do. Even as he healed others, Caleb wrestled with the moral consequences of his past. In journal entries from the 1860s, he reflects on the paradox of his skills. I have learned to preserve life as deftly as I have learned to end it. I have saved soldiers in the war, nursed them back from the brink, and yet the memory of the men I killed lingered. They were monsters, yet their deaths weigh heavily. My hands know both destruction and restoration, and in that duality I am neither whole nor forgiven. During the American Civil War, Caleb used an assumed identity to serve as a battlefield med. Here, the knowledge that once protected him and executed vengeance now became a tool for saving lives. He applied his understanding of pharmacology to treat infections, control bleeding, and manage pain. Twice he was wounded, recovering faster than doctors expected, his body tempered by years of careful observation, survival, and subtle self-experimentation. Through it all, Caleb remained anonymous, leaving behind no records beyond his own meticulous journal. The war ended in 1865, and he received an honorable discharge along with a modest pension, yet he returned to Canada as a man fundamentally changed, carrying both the skill and the solitude that had defined his existence. Life in Canada allowed Caleb a semblance of stability, but it did not undo the hollowing that years of survival had required. He lived quietly in a rural area, cultivating herbs, tending to gardens, and occasionally assisting those in medical need. Few knew him, and fewer still understood the full scope of his past. He remained unmarried, forming few personal attachments, guarding his isolation as fiercely as he had once guarded his life. To the outside world, he was merely an albino herbalist living on the margins, but the journals reveal the depth of his internal struggle, a man simultaneously shaped by oppression and freed by circumstance, yet incapable of fully participating in the ordinary joys of life. Caleb's journal, later discovered in 1947, provides an extraordinary window into both the horrors of slavery and the resilience of the human mind. It is not a daily record, but a series of reflective entries spanning nearly 50 years. Each entry demonstrates a remarkable synthesis of observational skill, scientific reasoning, and philosophical introspection. He documents not only plants' dosages and their physiological effects, but also his evolving understanding of human behavior and moral consequence. I have lived longer than most enslaved people, longer than most free men, certainly longer than Rutled or any master I ever encountered, he wrote, yet longevity does not equate to life. I have survived, yes, but at the cost of the very capacity to exist as a man among men. The discovery of Caleb's journal caused a stir among historians. The evidence it contained, scientific, historical, and personal, challenged entrenched assumptions about the capabilities of enslaved people and the nature of resistance. Elizabeth Hartwell, a medical historian writing in the Journal of Medical History in 1952, noted, "The methodologies described in Caleb's journal align perfectly with what we now understand about the toxic properties of the plants he used. Dosages, timing, and combinations demonstrate sophisticated understanding of pharmacokinetics. This was not folk medicine or superstition. This was applied science executed with precision by a man with exceptional observational and analytical intelligence." Other historical records corroborated Caleb's presence and actions. Census data from Canada show a man matching Caleb's description, an albino man, an herbalist, unmarried, living alone in a rural area, existing in. By 1901, no record exists, indicating that Caleb likely passed away during the 1890s, as suggested in his final journal entry. Despite numerous attempts, researchers could not locate a grave or definitive burial record under any of his known names, suggesting that he remained as he had lived, largely in the shadows of history.
The journal also provides insight into the broader implications of Caleb's action. His deliberate, calculated resistance to Rutled's cruelty inspired caution among neighboring masters and hope among enslaved communities. Accounts collected decades later tell of a ghostly pale figure who instilled fear in oppressive men and whispered possibility to the powerless. Marie Dawson, whose great-great-grandmother had witnessed the events in Mississippi, recalled in a 1951 interview, after Rutled's death, the other plantation owners became careful. They stopped the worst beatings, improved the food slightly, became suspicious of their drink. They even hired tasters to check their meals. For a time they remembered that we were human beings capable of thought and planning, not just property. Yet the story of Caleb is not merely one of tactical brilliance or supernatural legend. It is a meditation on the moral cost of survival under extreme oppression. Caleb's writings reveal the psychological and ethical toll of living as both observer and instrument of vengeance. I have removed everything soft and vulnerable, he notes in one of the final entries. I transformed myself into an instrument of resistance and revenge, and when that instrument is no longer needed, I find I do not know how to be human again. I have forgotten how to feel joy, how to trust, how to hope for anything except survival.
Historians and ethicists continue to debate Caleb's legacy. Some argue that he was justified, a freedom fighter wielding the only weapons available to him against an unjust system. Others see the story as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of violence, even when employed for righteous ends. Dr. Angela Freeman, an African-American historian writing in 2003, reflected, Caleb forces us to confront questions we would prefer to avoid. Was he justified by modern legal standards? No. He committed premeditated murder. But can modern legal frameworks apply to a system where enslaved people had no rights, no protection, and no recourse? Caleb chose violence deliberately, methodically. After exhausting other options, he targeted cruelty and oppression itself. He paid a terrible price, losing his humanity while preserving his life. The forensic confirmation of Caleb's methodology underscores the intersection of science, morality, and resistance. Soil analysis from the Rutled plantation revealed high concentrations of plant alkaloids consistent with Caleb's journal. The timing and combination of substances verified by later pharmacological study align precisely with his description. What Caleb achieved was not chance, nor folklore. It was the application of careful, patient knowledge under extraordinary circumstances. Yet even with this understanding, the narrative resists easy moral categorization. Caleb was neither a simple villain nor a clear hero. He was a product of the system that enslaved him, shaped by oppression into a person capable of calculated violence. His story illustrates the broader truth about the corrosive effects of slavery. It did not simply harm the powerless, it transformed them, forcing decisions that would have been unimaginable in a society built on justice. In life, Caleb remained largely invisible. In death, he left behind only the journals, the testimonies of those who knew him, and the faint enduring mark of his actions on the land itself. In 1998, the Warren County Historical Society erected a small marker near the former site of the Rutled plantation. It acknowledges the complexity of the historical record. On this land stood the Rutled plantation, site of one of the most controversial incidents in Warren County history. In September 1851, plantation owner Nathaniel Rutled died under circumstances that remain disputed. Official records attributed his death to natural causes. Other accounts suggest he was killed by an enslaved person using sophisticated knowledge of plant toxin. Whatever the truth, this incident serves as a reminder that the history of slavery is not simple, that resistance took many forms, and that enslaved people possessed intelligence, knowledge, and agency that the system attempted but failed to suppress. The marker sparked debate, with some locals protesting what they considered a commemoration of murder, while others praised it for presenting historical complexity. The story of Caleb forces all who encounter it to wrestle with uncomfortable questions: the nature of resistance, the ethics of violence in extremis, and the lasting moral consequences of oppression. By the end of his life, Caleb's legacy was both profound and haunting. He had survived the brutality of slavery, claimed agency where nearly none existed, and used knowledge as a weapon in a world built to strip him of all power. Yet the cost of his survival was immense. He lost not only friends and family, but the capacity to exist fully as a human being. Among others, he had become, in his own words, a ghost, long before his physical death. In this sense, Caleb's story transcends its historical moment. It is not just the tale of an albino slave who poisoned his master in the Mississippi cotton fields. It is a meditation on the human consequences of oppression, the complexity of resistance, and the moral ambiguity that arises when survival is contingent upon extraordinary measures. Caleb demonstrates that even in circumstances designed to dehumanize, intelligence, courage, and strategy can assert themselves, but at a cost that is neither simple nor small. The cotton fields where Nathaniel Rutled died have long since returned to wilderness, reclaimed by the same nature that once provided Caleb with the tools of his survival and resistance. The Yazoo River continues its course, flowing past the site as it has for centuries, witnessing history, transformation, and the persistence of human memory. Caleb's contemporaries are gone, but his story lives on in journals, oral histories, and the subtle traces of his existence in the landscape itself. Perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that Caleb was not a ghost. He was a man fully human, fully capable of thought and planning, driven to extraordinary acts by the conditions imposed upon him. And in recognizing this, we are forced to confront uncomfortable realities about human history, about oppression, and about the choices it can compel even the most intelligent, patient, and morally aware individuals to make. Caleb lived, killed, fled, healed, and died, leaving behind a narrative that challenges, disturbs, and illuminates. He is at once a figure of admiration, horror, and reflection, a reminder that even under the most extreme circumstances, human beings retain agency, but also that such agency may come at a profound cost to their own humanity. Even after decades of exile in Canada, Caleb remained haunted not by the fear of discovery or death, but by the weight of the choices he had made. His journal entries from the 1880s reveal a man wrestling with the consequences of a life lived at the margins of morality. "I am no longer capable of simple emotions," he wrote. "Joy, hope, love. These are luxuries reserved for those who have not seen the abyss and returned unchanged. I have survived, yes, but at the expense of the very faculties that make life meaningful." Caleb had come to understand that survival under extreme oppression was not merely a matter of fleeing or enduring. It required transformation. The skills he had honed to escape death and subjugation, the careful observation of human behavior, the manipulation of biology and chemistry, the patience to plan years ahead, were tools that separated him from ordinary humanity. They were necessary, yet they isolated him, creating a chasm between himself and the world around him. He could help, heal, teach, and guide, but he could not fully participate in normal human life. Each connection he attempted, whether with neighbors, patients, or fellow freedmen, ended with a reminder of his otherness, his past, or the coldness he had cultivated as a shield. In some entries, Caleb reflects on the philosophical dimensions of his existence. "The system that enslaved me did more than strip me of freedom," he wrote. "It stripped me of innocence, of naivete, of the capacity to assume goodness in others. I became an instrument of justice as defined by necessity, not morality. In doing so, I preserved my life and avenged wrongs, yet I forfeited my soul to the calculus of survival." Despite the isolation, Caleb's intellectual life flourished. He became a voracious reader, exploring medical texts, scientific journals, and philosophical treatises. His understanding of chemistry expanded beyond the toxicology of plants into broader domains, pharmacology, physiology, and even early microbiology. Yet his studies were always practical, always tethered to a question: could knowledge save or destroy? Could it preserve life or exact revenge? In this pursuit, Caleb achieved a kind of mastery unparalleled among men of his background. His mind became a weapon, his intellect a fortress against the vulnerability that had defined his early life. Caleb's interactions with the local communities were cautious and deliberate. When people fell ill, they sought him quietly, often with whispered inquiries. He treated ailments ranging from common infections to chronic pain, combining herbal remedies with careful observation and experimental adjustment. Those who benefited from his knowledge often assumed it was folk magic or simple intuition, never realizing the depth of science behind each potion or poultice. Caleb's journals, later discovered, revealed the meticulous record-keeping behind each treatment, dosages, timing, reactions, and modifications, all executed with precision and a level of understanding that would impress trained physicians of the era. Yet his past continued to intrude, manifesting not in legal pursuit, but in the psychological residue of violence. He revisited the events of 1851 repeatedly, analyzing every step, every choice, every risk he had taken. "I knew the consequences," he wrote, "yet knowledge gave me confidence. Knowledge gave me control, but in mastering the body and mind of my oppressor, I became estranged from my own. The hand that calculated Rutled's demise could just as easily destroy life at whim. That realization is a burden that time cannot lighten." The theme of moral ambiguity pervades Caleb's reflections. He is neither unrepentant nor absolved.
He acknowledges the efficacy of his actions and the necessity imposed by oppression, yet he recognizes the dehumanizing effect of becoming an agent of premeditated violence. In one particularly striking entry, he muses, "Monsters are not born, they are made. Rutled was a monster of oppression. I became a monster of resistance. One is nurtured by cruelty, the other by necessity, yet both are both are consequences of systems that demand more than a man can bear without transformation." Caleb's correspondence with other escaped slaves reveals another facet of his life, mentorship and guide. He occasionally aided those fleeing the United States, offering safe passage advice, herbal remedies for the journey, and instruction on how to move silently and avoid detection. He did not provide maps or direct assistance indiscriminately, aware that exposure could jeopardize both his safety and theirs. His guidance was always indirect, emphasizing knowledge and preparation over direct intervention. Even in these acts of solidarity, his detachment is apparent. He helps without fully engaging, teaches without forming bonds, always cautious not to allow vulnerability into his life. By the late 1880s, Caleb had also begun reflecting on the broader social implications of slavery and oppression. His journal entries explore not only his personal journey, but the systemic realities that produced men like Rutled and circumstances like his own. Systems do not merely oppress, they create. They shape men into monsters, and others into instruments of survival. The morality of any single act cannot be understood outside the framework of the conditions that necessitate it. To judge a man without understanding the system that molded him is to simplify history and human experience. One particularly chilling entry describes Caleb's contemplation of legacy. He feared being remembered only as a murderer, or worse, as a ghostly figure divorced from humanity. Yet he also recognized that erasure was the fate of those who had no power to resist. "I will vanish from the records as so many of my brethren have," he wrote, "and yet my actions remain, recorded in the lives of those affected, in the tremor of fear I once planted in oppressors, in the survival I inspired in the oppressed." Perhaps this is the only immortality available to those denied ordinary life, to leave consequences, even when one's existence is otherwise invisible. Caleb's death, like his life, was largely unobserved. Census records indicate no trace after 1901, and no burial site has been located. His journal, mailed anonymously to the Warren County Historical Society nearly half a century later, is the only tangible legacy of the man who was once whispered about as the White Ghost of Warren County. The journal contains not only accounts of his past deeds, but also philosophical reflections, medical observations, and an unflinching analysis of human behavior under extreme conditions. Its publication in 1950 prompted intense debate among historians, ethicists, and the public. Some praised it as a unique and invaluable record of resistance and agency among enslaved people, while others questioned the morality of celebrating acts of lethal retribution, even under the constraints of slavery. Forensic analysis later confirmed the veracity of Caleb's account. Soil samples from the Rutled plantation revealed high concentrations of toxic plant compounds described in the journal, while handwriting analysis authenticated decades of entries spanning nearly 50 years. Medical historians and toxicologists verified that the substances, combinations, and dosages detailed were sufficient to produce the outcomes Caleb described, underscoring the precision and knowledge underlying what had once seemed like legend or superstition. Yet beyond science and verification, Caleb's story resonates as a meditation on human resilience, intelligence, and moral complexity. He demonstrates that the oppressed are not merely passive victims, they are agents capable of strategy, foresight, and resist. But he also illustrates that such agency comes with profound personal cost. The tools of survival, knowledge, patience, calculation, can isolate the user from ordinary life, transforming the survivor into a figure as tragic as the oppressor they overcame. The legacy of Caleb's actions extended beyond his lifetime. The fear instilled in neighboring masters by his deeds prompted small but significant changes in treatment of enslaved people, improved food, slightly reduced beatings, and increased caution in dealings with slaves. Though these changes were limited and inconsistent, they represent an indirect form of resistance, a demonstration that one person's actions can ripple outward, altering behavior and creating pockets of humanity even within oppressive systems. Caleb's survival became both a warning and a source of hope, a reminder that resistance, though costly, is possible, and that knowledge can empower those who would otherwise have none. In reflecting on Caleb's life, modern historians grapple with questions that defy simple resolution. Was he justified in killing Rutled? Could the moral calculus of slavery allow for premeditated violence as a form of survival? Does his story illustrate the heroism of resistance, or the tragedy of transformation into something unrecognizable even to oneself? The answers are not simple. Caleb was neither wholly villain nor wholly hero. He was a man shaped by circumstances, intelligence, and necessity, navigating a world designed to strip him of agency and humanity, yet refusing to yield entirely. Caleb's journal closes with reflections that are both haunting and profoundly human. "I am dying," he wrote in the final entry, dated around 8. "I have no regrets, yet I have no satisfaction. I killed, I survived, I endured, but in the process, I lost more than I gained. Freedom is not mere survival. Life is not mere existence. I have preserved the former at the expense of the latter. Perhaps the lesson of my life is that oppression creates its own monsters, and that resistance, however justified, comes with consequences that no man can fully bear." The land that witnessed Caleb's actions has long since returned to nature. The cotton fields where Rutled died have been reclaimed by forest and river, carrying with them the residues of history, transformation, and memory. The Yazoo River flows past the site as it has for centuries, bearing silent witness to the intersection of human cruelty, intelligence, and resistance. Caleb's contemporaries are gone, yet his story survives in journals, in oral histories, and in the moral questions it leaves behind. Caleb was never a ghost in the supernatural sense. He was a man, flesh and blood, capable of extraordinary intelligence, patience, and violence. He was forced by oppression to make choices no one should have to face, and he survived by becoming both clever and ruthless. In recognizing this, we confront not only Caleb's life, but the broader truths about human history, the systems that dehumanize, the costs of survival, and the moral ambiguities that endure long after acts of violence have passed. This story compels reflection. How do societies create circumstances where such choices become necessary? How do individuals maintain morality when survival demands extraordinary measures? And what responsibility do we bear to ensure that such systems of oppression never arise again? Caleb's life is a reminder that history is complex, morality is nuanced, and human agency, even under the harshest conditions, is both powerful and perilous. To remember Caleb is to remember the full spectrum of human experience under slavery, the courage, the intelligence, the suffering, and the moral ambiguity. He was a survivor, a scholar, a healer, a killer, and a ghost of memory and history. His life demonstrates that resistance takes many forms, sometimes heroic, sometimes horrifying, but always human. In the final reckoning, Caleb's story is not merely about death or vengeance. It is about the capacity for human agency in the face of dehumanizing systems, the price exacted by survival, and the ethical and emotional consequences of a life spent navigating extreme. It challenges us to consider the cost of resistance, the nature of freedom, and the moral landscapes created by oppression. Caleb lived, endured, and died, and in doing so, he left a testament not only to what was possible, but to what humanity can demand of itself when confronted with injustice.
Caleb's story does not end with his death in Canada, for the consequences of his life, of his actions and choices echoed long after he vanished from records. The journal he left behind became a prism through which historians, ethicists, and descendants of both enslaved people and slaveholders confronted the unsettling truths of the antebellum South. Its publication in 1950 sparked debate not only about the morality of his deeds, but about the very nature of historical memory and the ways stories of resistance are told. Some called Caleb a murderer, others called him a freedom fighter. Few were willing to confront the uncomfortable truth. He was both, and neither. The moral ambiguity of his life challenges modern sensibilities. In a society where the rule of law, justice, and human rights are assumed to exist, premeditated killing is always condemned. But Caleb lived in a world where none of those protections applied to him. Slavery was a system designed to strip agency, erase humanity, and institutionalize cruelty. In that system, violence was both a tool of survival and an instrument of resistance. Caleb's careful planning, his scientific application of botanical poisons, and his willingness to sacrifice his humanity were responses to circumstances most of us can scarcely imagine. To judge him by contemporary moral standards is to ignore the brutal realities of the system that shaped him. The historical record supports Caleb's intelligence and sophistication. The forensic evidence unearthed decades later, soil tests confirming high concentrations of toxic alkaloids at the Rutled plantation, detailed handwriting analysis authenticating the journal, and medical evaluations validating his understanding of pharmacology, cements his story as more than folklore. He was not a mythical white ghost, nor a figure of superstition. He was a man armed with knowledge, patience, and resolve, who executed his plan with the precision of a scientist and the prudence of someone acutely aware of risk. Yet it is the human dimension that haunts Caleb's reflections in his journal reveal a man stripped of ordinary emotion, hollowed by necessity, and profoundly isolated. He saved lives as a healer and educated himself in medicine and science, yet he could not reclaim the life he might have had, one of joy, community, or even intimacy. The acts that ensured his survival also constructed the walls that separated him from others. "I have survived at the cost of being fully human," he wrote. "In preserving my life, I lost my ability to participate in the lives of others. I became a ghost long before I was called one." The social impact of Caleb's deeds was subtle but significant. His acts of resistance spread fear among nearby plantation owners, prompting small changes in the treatment of enslaved people, a cautious moderation in beatings, increased attention to food and drink safety, and a general awareness that enslaved individuals were capable of agency and strategic action. These changes, though incremental, illustrate how one act of resistance can ripple outward, affecting not only the immediate context, but influencing behavior across a broader social landscape. Caleb's calculated defiance demonstrated that knowledge could be weaponized, that intellect could challenge brute power, and that resistance need not take the form of open rebellion to be effective. Caleb's legacy also extends to the ethical questions it raises. Scholars like Angela Freeman have debated the implications of his story in modern terms. Was he morally justified? Did his actions constitute self-defense, revenge, or calculated murder? Could acts of extreme resistance ever be ethically sanctioned when all other avenues of recourse are denied? Freeman's conclusion is sobering. Caleb's life forces us to confront the moral complexities imposed by oppression. Systems of injustice create situations in which the traditional binary of right and wrong cannot fully apply. Resistance is sometimes morally necessary, yet carries a cost that transforms the one who resists. Even today, Caleb's story resonates in discussions about oppression, systemic injustice, and moral agents. It serves as a case study in the psychological and ethical consequences of living under extreme constraint, offering insight into the ways marginalized people navigate survival when denied ordinary means of protection or justice. His life prompts reflection on contemporary parallels, regions where authoritarianism, human trafficking, or systemic abuse force individuals into morally fraught decisions, situations where knowledge and cunning may be the only tools available to resist harm. In these contexts, Caleb's experience is more than history. It is a lens through which to examine ongoing struggles for survival and justice. Caleb's journal also reveals the limits of human adaptability. While he survived the physical dangers of slavery, the psychological and emotional toll was profound. Years spent cultivating patience, observation, and analytical intelligence to manipulate his environment ultimately resulted in a kind of emotional desiccation. He could calculate, plan, and manipulate with precision, but he could not restore the innate emotional capacities that define ordinary human existence. This psychological cost underscores a harsh truth. Survival in extreme conditions may preserve the body, but exacts an often hidden toll on the soul. The broader historical significance of Caleb's story is intertwined with memory and narrative. The marker erected near the Rutled plantation in 1998, which refrains from naming Caleb or describing the specifics of Rutled's death, reflects a tension inherent in public history, the challenge of acknowledging complex truths without simplifying or sanitizing. By not presenting Caleb as purely heroic or wholly villainous, the marker acknowledges the moral ambiguity inherent in resistance under oppression. It invites reflection rather than prescriptive judgment, reminding visitors that history is rarely simple, and human choices are rarely cleanly categorized. Caleb's life, recorded meticulously in his journal, serves as a testament to the extraordinary agency of enslaved individuals. It challenges stereotypes of passivity, victimhood, or helplessness often associated with enslaved populations. He was capable of foresight, strategic planning, and scientific reasoning, all attributes traditionally denied in narratives about enslaved people. Yet his story is also a cautionary tale. The very skills that allowed him to survive and resist oppression also isolated him from ordinary human connection, leaving him a figure both extraordinary and tragic. In the final analysis, Caleb embodies the dualities imposed by oppression: hero and executioner, survivor and ghost, healer and killer, intellect and exile. His existence confronts us with uncomfortable truths about human resilience, ethical compromise, and the costs of survival. His story refuses easy categorization and resists simplistic moral judgment. It compels us to ask difficult questions. How much can one preserve one's humanity while fighting to survive? How do systems of oppression deform moral landscapes, forcing choices that violate conventional ethics? And how do societies remember those whose resistance defies easy moral labels?
Caleb's death, unrecorded and largely anonymous, mirrors the obscurity in which many acts of resistance occurred. Yet unlike many who resisted and vanished without record, his meticulous documentation ensures that history remembers him, not as legend or myth, but as a fully realized human being, capable of both intelligence and violence, courage and isolation. Through his journal, Caleb speaks across time, reminding us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, human beings retain agency, knowledge, and the capacity to act. Yet he also warns that exercising that agency comes at a profound cost. Ultimately, Caleb's story is both inspirational and unsettling. It illustrates that intelligence, knowledge, and patience are powerful tools of resistance, capable of altering history and shaping the behavior of oppressors. Yet it also demonstrates that survival in extreme conditions can exact psychological and moral tolls as severe as physical oppression itself. His legacy is not easily celebrated, for the methods he employed, while effective and justified within the context of slavery, involved calculated killing and the deliberate transformation of a man into a ghostly instrument of vengeance. Caleb's narrative also highlights the importance of memory, testimony, and historical preservation. Without his journal, and without the careful stewardship of those who eventually made it public, the depth and complexity of his life might have been lost entirely. His story reminds historians, scholars, and the public that understanding the past requires engagement with moral ambiguity, acknowledgement of human complexity, and an openness to confronting uncomfortable truths. It teaches that history is not merely a record of events, but a repository of human experience, choice, and consequence. In remembering Caleb, we remember more than one man. We remember the countless unnamed and unrecorded, who resisted in ways small and large, overt and subtle, in defiance of a system designed to erase them. We are reminded that oppression produces both victims and agents of resistance, that knowledge and cunning can empower those denied conventional power, and that the human capacity for agency is profound, even under the harshest conditions. But we are also reminded that the exercise of such agency can exact costs beyond the physical, altering the moral and emotional fabric of those who survive. Caleb's story challenges us to think deeply about resistance, morality, and justice. It compels reflection on how societies create circumstances in which human beings are forced into ethically complex decisions. It warns that the pursuit of survival and justice can transform individuals, sometimes in ways they neither desire nor anticipate. And it underscores that understanding history requires embracing complexity rather than reducing it to heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, right and wrong. The white ghost of Warren County was never a ghost at all. He was Caleb, a man whose life and actions illuminate the capacities, costs, and ambiguities of human resistance under oppression. His survival, his intellect, and his calculated vengeance remind us that the oppressed are rarely powerless, that resistance takes many forms, and that history often defies simplistic moral categorization. Caleb lived, acted, and died, leaving a legacy as profound as it is disturbing, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the tragic consequences of surviving under a system designed to destroy you. His story remains a mirror in which we can examine both history and ourselves, a lens through which to understand oppression, resistance, and the moral complexities they produce. And perhaps, in remembering Caleb, we honor not just his life, but the intelligence, courage, and agency of all those who survived and resisted the dehumanizing structures of their time. Even decades after his death, Caleb's presence lingered in the collective memory of the region, though often in fragmentary whispers and half-remembered stories. To the descendants of those enslaved, he became a symbol, a figure representing resistance in its most calculated, dangerous, and morally complex form. To the descendants of slaveholders, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that cruelty has consequences, and that the knowledge of the oppressed can be turned into a weapon. What made Caleb so remarkable was that his actions were not born of brute strength or mob violence, but of intellect, observation, and patience, qualities that society had refused to recognize or cultivate in enslaved people. The impact of Caleb's methods, his precise manipulation of plant toxins, and his strategic planning, was felt far beyond the Rutled plantation. Historians who examined letters, diaries, and legal records from surrounding plantations noted subtle shifts in behavior after plantation owners became warier, their confidence undermined by the fear that slaves might possess knowledge capable of undermining them in ways that left no evidence. Some hired tasters, implemented new protocols for meals, or even reduced the severity of punishments, not out of newfound morality, but from self-preservation. Caleb's resistance, while singular, created ripples of behavioral change that extended into a form of deterrent effect, a silent assertion of agency, by those whom society deemed powerless. Yet the consequences for Caleb himself were profoundly personal. The journal reveals a man caught between two worlds, one of survival and calculated action, and another of the human connection he had long been denied. Even as he mastered medicine and chemistry, even as he navigated the complex networks of the Underground Railroad, Caleb remained profoundly isolated. Relationships were tenuous, friendships were rare, intimacy was largely impossible. His existence became one of observation rather than participation, of planning rather than spontaneity, of living as a ghost while maintaining a body in the world. "I am alive," he wrote in his final entries, "but I am not a man who lives in the ordinary. I survive, and in surviving, I have become something other than human." The moral implications of Caleb's choices continue to provoke debate. Scholars and ethicists have grappled with the question of justification. Was he a hero using the only tools available in a world that denied him legal, moral, and physical protection, or was he a murderer who sacrificed his humanity in the pursuit of revenge? Modern legal and ethical frameworks cannot fully address the dilemmas he faced, because he existed in a space where law and justice were privileges systematically denied to him. Caleb did not act in anger or impulse. He acted strategically, deliberately, and with full awareness of risk and consequence. His target was not arbitrary, but specific: those who embodied cruelty, violence, and the systemic oppression of human beings. In reflecting on his life, one sees the paradox of resistance under extreme oppression. It can empower, but it can also consume. Caleb's intelligence and agency allowed him to survive, but they exacted a cost in emotional and social alienation. By mastering the very systems designed to dominate him, he transformed himself into an instrument of resistance, but one who could no longer fully participate in ordinary human existence. This is the duality that makes his story both inspiring and profoundly unsettling. Survival, in its most calculated form, often demands a sacrifice of selfhood. The legacy of Caleb extends into modern historical understanding. His story challenges simplistic narratives of slavery and resistance, reminding us that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own survival. It also demonstrates that resistance can take forms we might not traditionally recognize as heroic, quiet, intellectual, and highly strategic, rather than overt and physical. The meticulous application of botanical knowledge, the careful orchestration of events, and the patient observation required to execute his plan reflect an intelligence often unacknowledged in historical accounts of enslaved population. Caleb was exceptional not simply because of his actions, but because of the profound thought, skill, and planning that underpinned them. Moreover, Caleb's story highlights the profound moral ambiguities that oppression creates. Systems that strip individuals of legal and moral recourse can transform ordinary human choices into ethical dilemmas with no clear solution. Violence may become the only effective tool, yet using it carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate act. Caleb's journal demonstrates that while he was able to exact vengeance and secure his survival, he could not reclaim the parts of himself sacrificed in the process. His humanity was preserved only in fragments, buried beneath layers of strategic thought, careful observation, and emotional detachment. The publication of Caleb's journal also prompted broader reflection on the importance of preserving voices from marginalized and oppressed communities. Without the journal, his story would likely have faded into myth, misremembered or sanitized in ways that reinforced conventional narratives. Instead, historians, ethnographers, and descendants gained access to a direct, unvarnished account of resistance, one that highlighted both ingenuity and the profound personal cost of survival. In this way, Caleb's legacy is not only historical, but also pedagogical. It teaches us about resilience, agency, morality, and the human capacity to navigate extreme circumstances. The social and cultural impact of Caleb's story can also be traced through oral histories collected from descendants of enslaved people in the Mississippi region. Stories of the white ghost circulated for decades, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes quietly retold in hushed tone. These tales served multiple purposes. They reinforced communal memory, instilled hope, and preserved knowledge that escaped official documentation. Caleb's story demonstrates how legends emerge from lived experience, how the acts of a single individual can shape collective understanding, and how memory operates as a mechanism of empowerment and caution. Even as historians have debated the ethics of Caleb's actions, his life has inspired discussions about the broader consequences of systemic injustice. His story is a cautionary tale about the transformative effects of oppression, how it can turn ordinary human beings into instruments of survival, capable of extraordinary thought, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary violence. It underscores the truth that oppression produces not only victims, but also agents of resistance, and that those agents in turn carry moral and psychological burdens that may endure long after the immediate threat has passed.
The final entries of Caleb's journal, written in the early 1890s, capture the poignancy of his reflections. He recognized that he had survived not simply through luck, but through extraordinary patience, observation, and knowledge. Yet he also understood that survival had required a cost greater than most could imagine: the erosion of joy, intimacy, and ordinary human experience. In writing, he attempted to make sense of a life shaped by extreme conditions, a life in which every choice was measured against the potential for survival or annihilation. The journal concludes with a meditation on legacy, morality, and human capacity, leaving readers with questions that remain unresolved, complex, and deeply human. In the decades following the journal's publication, Caleb's story has been revisited in academic, literary, and cultural contexts. Historians have used it to explore strategies of resistance among enslaved populations. Medical historians have examined the pharmacological sophistication it demonstrates, and ethicists have debated its implications for understanding morality under extreme oppression. For descendants of enslaved people, it serves as a source of empowerment and recognition, a reminder that those who suffered were not passive, but active participants in shaping their own lives and history. The story of Caleb also serves as a lens for contemporary reflection on systems of oppression and resistance. In modern contexts, whether under authoritarian regimes, in human trafficking networks, or within societies with systemic inequalities, individuals may face choices that echo the moral complexity Caleb confronted. Knowledge, strategy, and careful planning can be tools of survival, yet they often come at a psychological and ethical cost. Caleb's life demonstrates that survival and agency are never free, that every act of resistance carries consequences that ripple outward, affecting not only the individual but the broader social fabric. Ultimately, Caleb's story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, morality, and the consequences of oppression. It reminds us that acts of resistance may not always conform to conventional definitions of heroism, and that survival under extreme conditions can require sacrifices that are profound, permanent, and deeply personal. It also reminds us that history is rarely simple, that human agency persists even under the harshest conditions, and that the legacies of oppression continue to shape moral and social landscapes long after the immediate circumstances have passed. The white ghost of Warren County, once whispered about in fear and awe, was never supernatural. He was Caleb, a man of extraordinary intelligence, patience, and courage, who used knowledge as both a shield and a weapon. He lived, acted, and died, leaving behind a legacy that is at once inspiring, unsettling, and profoundly human. His story forces us to reflect on the costs of resistance, the complexities of morality under oppression, and the enduring capacity of human beings to assert agency, even when every system around them seeks to strip it away. In remembering Caleb, we remember more than one man. We remember the countless others who resisted in ways large and small, overt and subtle, whose stories were rarely documented but whose lives collectively shaped history. We are reminded that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience and ingenuity, even under conditions designed to destroy them, and we are reminded that the moral and psychological consequences of survival can be as profound as the physical dangers themselves. The land where Caleb once walked, the cotton fields along the Yazoo River, the swamps he traversed, the forests that hid him during his escape, has long since returned to wilderness. Trees, grasses, and rivers reclaimed the places of human suffering, absorbing the legacies of both cruelty and resistance into the ongoing cycles of life and decay. Yet the story of Caleb endures, preserved in the pages of his journal, the memories of descendants, and the careful work of historians. He remains a testament to human agency, a reflection on morality under oppression, and a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings possess the capacity to shape their own destinies. Caleb's life forces us to ask, what does it mean to survive? At what cost can survival be achieved? How do systems of oppression distort morality, agency, and humanity? His story provides no simple answers, but it compels us to engage with the complexity of history, the depth of human resilience, and the enduring questions of justice and morality that remain relevant today. In the end, Caleb is neither fully hero nor fully villain. He is human, tragic, brilliant, fearful, courageous, and profoundly consequential, a reminder that the capacity for both good and harm exists in all of us,
shaped by circumstance, choice, and the forces of history. Even after his death, Caleb's presence lingered like a shadow across the Mississippi landscape. The fields he once walked, the forests and swamps he navigated in secret, and the banks of the Yazoo River where he paused to rest during his flight from bondage, all of it became part of a story that outlived him. To local residents and descendants of enslaved people, Caleb was both legend and cautionary tale. He was the white ghost, the man who could not be controlled, who wielded knowledge as a weapon, and who defied the system that sought to strip him of humanity. In whispers and tales, in both fear and admiration, he became immortalized, but never fully understood. Historians revisiting Caleb's journal often remarked on the subtlety of his impact. His actions did not lead to widespread rebellion, nor did they dismantle slavery. Yet by demonstrating that knowledge could rival physical force, he challenged the assumptions of both masters and fellow slaves. Plantation owners became more cautious, introducing measures like food tasters, stricter surveillance, and careful monitoring of slaves' movement. Subtle fear spread among the elite, illustrating that oppression is never absolute, and that intellect can be as threatening as strength. Caleb's resistance, though solitary, created a ripple effect that temporarily shifted power dynamics in the region, a reminder that even small acts of defiance can resonate far beyond their immediate context. Yet Caleb paid a heavy personal price. His journal reveals a man trapped between survival and the human connections he could never fully claim. Intimacy and friendship were rare, joy was fleeting, and trust was a concept almost entirely foreign. He existed in constant vigilance, always measuring risk, always calculating the consequences of every choice. To outsiders, he might have seemed cold or detached, but those who read his reflections understand that this was a survival mechanism, a protective shell forged in response to unimaginable oppression. "I am alive," he wrote, "but I do not truly live. I survive, and in surviving, I have become something other than human." The moral complexity of Caleb's story continues to challenge scholars and ethicists. Can premeditated killing ever be justified when legal and moral recourse are systematically denied? Caleb targeted individuals who personified the cruelty of slavery, those whose violence was unchecked and normalized. He acted not in passion or randomness, but with careful calculation, using knowledge and observation as his tools. Yet in doing so, he transformed himself. The very intelligence and agency that enabled his survival also eroded his humanity. He became an instrument of vengeance and resistance, a ghost of himself even before death claimed him. The publication of Caleb's journal in 1950 brought his story to a wider audience, sparking debate over the ethics of resistance and the historical portrayal of enslaved people. Some historians lauded it as a groundbreaking account of agency and intelligence under oppression, while others criticized it for depicting murder too sympathetically. For descendants of enslaved people, however, it was a validation, a recognition, that those who suffered were not passive, but actively shaping their own destiny. Caleb's story highlighted the extraordinary lengths to which enslaved individuals went to reclaim some measure of power, and the ingenuity, courage, and patience required to do so. Oral histories collected in the decades following the journal's publication confirmed that Caleb's legacy persisted in the collective memory. Stories of the white ghost circulated among enslaved communities, inspiring both fear and hope. For some, the tale demonstrated that resistance was possible, even when physical escape or open rebellion seemed unattainable. For others, it served as a warning about the personal costs of defiance, the emotional isolation, the moral compromises, and the permanent changes wrought by necessity. Caleb's life became a symbol of both possibility and sacrifice, a figure whose story could neither be simplified nor ignored. The ethical questions raised by Caleb's actions remain unresolved. He survived by turning knowledge into a weapon, yet survival came at the cost of emotional and social alienation. Could he have resisted differently? Perhaps, but the historical record suggests that all other avenues were closed. Legal systems, societal norms, and the very structure of slavery offered him no protection, no justice, no recourse. Violence became the only viable path to agency. By acting with intelligence and restraint, targeting only those whose cruelty demanded it, Caleb attempted to impose a moral framework onto circumstances designed to strip morality from every interaction. Yet the psychological toll was immense. His journal entries reveal a man acutely aware that his survival required a transformation that few could imagine or endure. The wider historical significance of Caleb's story extends beyond individual morality. It illuminates the strategies of resistance employed by enslaved people, challenging the narrative that they were helpless or passive. By carefully documenting his methods, Caleb provides historians with insight into the intellectual and practical tools used to survive and his understanding of pharmacology, biology, and human behavior demonstrates a sophisticated application of knowledge often denied to enslaved populations. In doing so, he underscores the fact that intelligence and agency persist even under the most restrictive conditions. Caleb's legacy also prompts reflection on the nature of oppression itself. Systems designed to dominate and dehumanize inevitably create conditions where violence becomes a form of agency. By resisting, Caleb reclaimed a measure of control over his life, yet the act of resistance transformed him in ways that were irreversible. His story compels us to consider the consequences of systemic injustice, how it shapes individuals, forces impossible choices, and leaves lasting scars on both personal and collective level. It reminds us that historical events are rarely simple, that morality under oppression is complex, and that human agency can manifest in both extraordinary and unsettling ways. Decades later, forensic analysis of the Rutled plantation site validated Caleb's account. Soil samples revealed traces of the plant toxins he described, while historical records confirmed the sequence of events he had meticulously planned. These findings bridged the gap between legend and documented history, providing tangible evidence of his ingenuity and confirming that his methods were grounded in real knowledge rather than superstition. Caleb's journal, supported by forensic data, transforms him from mythic figure to historical agent, a person whose intellect, courage, and strategic skill shaped events in profound ways. The cultural resonance of Caleb's story is equally profound. For descendants of enslaved people, he represents a figure of empowerment, demonstrating that intelligence and patience can challenge even the most brutal systems. For scholars, he offers a rare glimpse into the cognitive strategies of resistance. For the broader public, his life forces uncomfortable but necessary reflection on the costs of survival, the complexities of morality, and the long shadows cast by oppression. In all these contexts, Caleb challenges assumptions about heroism, resistance, and the human capacity for agency under extreme duress. Caleb's story also underscores the importance of preserving marginalized voices. Without his journal, his life might have been reduced to folklore or entirely forgotten. The act of documenting and sharing his experiences provides future generations with insight into the realities of slavery, the intelligence and agency of those oppressed, and the moral complexities they face. It is a testament to the power of written history to challenge narratives, amplify silenced voices, and reshape our understanding of the past. Even today, the lessons of Caleb's life remain relevant. Across the globe, people continue to face systems of oppression, forced into moral and ethical dilemmas reminiscent of those he navigated. Knowledge, observation, and strategy remain tools of survival, yet the psychological and moral costs persist. Caleb's life demonstrates that survival is never neutral. It is an active, deliberate process that shapes character, morality, and humanity itself. In the end, Caleb's story is not easily categorized. He is neither wholly hero nor wholly villain. He is human, complex, resourceful, courageous, and profoundly shaped by circumstance. His life embodies the paradoxes of resistance. It demonstrates the power of agency, while highlighting the costs of survival. It reveals the potential of intellect, while exposing the vulnerabilities of isolation. And it illuminates the moral ambiguities inherent in a system designed to strip humanity from its subjects. The land he once walked has long since reclaimed itself. The cotton fields along the Yazoo River, the forests and swamps that hid him, have returned to nature. Yet the legacy of his actions persists in historical records, oral histories, and collective memory. Caleb's story continues to challenge, to disturb, and to inspire reflection on the human capacity for both resilience and moral complexity. In remembering him, we confront not only the horrors of slavery, but also the extraordinary courage, intelligence, and resourcefulness that survival demanded. Caleb's life forces us to ask, how far can one go to assert agency under oppression? What is the cost of survival when morality, humanity, and justice are denied? Can acts of resistance ever be fully judged by conventional standards, or must they be understood within the context of extraordinary circumstances? His journal does not offer simple answers, but it does provide a mirror through which we can examine human resilience, ingenuity, and the consequences of systemic injustice. In remembering Caleb, we honor not just one man, but the countless others whose resistance, ingenuity, and courage shaped history in ways often overlooked. He was a survivor, a strategist, and a figure who reminds us that knowledge can be both shield and sword, and that human beings possess the capacity for agency, even in the darkest circumstance. Caleb was, in every sense, the white ghost, an enduring testament to the complexities of oppression, resistance, and the human spirit.
Even after the physical traces of Caleb's life vanished, his story continued to resonate through generations, particularly among the descendants of enslaved people and historians who sought to understand the depths of resistance under slavery. The legend of the white ghost persisted not merely as folklore, but as an emblem of intellectual agency and moral complexity in a society built on systematic oppression. Caleb's life demonstrated that survival under slavery required more than strength. It demanded cunning, patience, and an intimate understanding of human behavior, biology, and chemistry. In every aspect, he transformed what others might see as weakness, his pale skin, his solitary nature, into a source of power. The cultural memory of Caleb evolved over time. Stories passed down orally in black communities emphasized his ingenuity and the subtle terror he inspired among slaveholders. He made them afraid of their own food and drink, one descendant recalled in an interview conducted in the 1960s, echoing tales passed down by her grandmother. They didn't know if the next meal would be their last, and for a little while they remembered we were human. In this way, Caleb's actions, though localized and personal, had a broader impact. They instilled fear, yes, but more importantly, they demonstrated that enslaved people could exercise agency even in a system designed to deny it. The ripple effects of his calculated resistance altered behavior and subtly reshaped the dynamics on plantations across the region. Historians examining Caleb's journal have noted that his understanding of human psychology was as sophisticated as his knowledge of plant toxins. He manipulated perception, cultivated uncertainty, and orchestrated events so that his adversaries would act in predictable ways. His ability to anticipate human behavior allowed him to turn subtle fear into leverage, creating a system of deterrence without the need for brute force. This level of strategic thinking, combined with an encyclopedic knowledge of pharmacology and anatomy, distinguishes Caleb as a figure of extraordinary intellect and ingenuity. He was a tactician as much as he was a survivor, demonstrating that resistance can take forms as intellectual and psychological as they are physical. Yet, as his journal reveals, Caleb's mastery of these tools came at a profound cost. Survival required isolation, secrecy, and a level of calculation that eroded his emotional life. Intimacy was almost impossible. Trust was dangerous. Even in Canada, where he finally found relative freedom, he remained socially isolated, engaging with the world cautiously and selectively. His life became a study in self-discipline, vigilance, and the moral compromises imposed by a system designed to dehumanize. While he saved his own life, he sacrificed much of what makes life meaningful: joy, companionship, and the ability to fully participate in community. The journal repeatedly emphasizes this tension: survival versus humanity, agency versus connection, knowledge versus innocence. Caleb's life also forces contemporary readers to grapple with ethical ambiguity. Can one condemn him for murder when he lived under a system where legal protection was denied and violence was normalized against him? Can we separate his actions from the systemic cruelty that necessitated them? These are questions without easy answers. His deliberate, careful, and highly targeted actions suggest a moral framework that guided him even as he committed acts society would label criminal. Yet, the psychological toll of those acts, his acknowledgement that he became a ghost, hollowed out to survive, reveals the human cost of resistance when constrained by injustice. He embodies the paradox of oppressed agency. The very acts that restore control also exact profound personal price. The historical and forensic evidence supporting Caleb's story is compelling. Analysis of the soil from the Rutled plantation revealed alkaloid concentrations consistent with the toxins he described. Handwriting comparisons and paper dating corroborated the timeline of his journal entry. These objective markers bridge the gap between folklore and documented history, providing concrete evidence of his presence, his methods, and the deliberate nature of his action. Caleb emerges not as a mythical figure, but as a real person whose intellect and courage were exercised in tangible, measurable ways. The publication of his journal in 1950 generated both acclaim and controversy. Scholars praised the detailed accounts of resistance and the insights into enslaved people's strategies, while critics questioned the morality of depicting murder sympathetic. For descendants of enslaved people, however, Caleb's story represented a rare acknowledgement of agency and intelligence under slavery. It validated the oral histories that had circulated for generations and provided a tangible link to acts of defiance that had often been marginalized or dismissed. In this way, the journal not only documents history, but also reshapes cultural memory, offering a narrative that recognizes the complexity and humanity of those oppressed. Caleb's story also serves as a lens for examining the long-term effects of systemic violence. The physical brutality of slavery is obvious, but Caleb's life highlights the psychological and moral consequences of living under constant threat and control. Resistance requires not only courage, but also the willingness to compromise one's moral and emotional. His reflections on the necessity of becoming an instrument of vengeance underscore the ways in which oppressive systems shape not only external behavior, but also internal identity. In this sense, Caleb's story transcends historical specificity, offering lessons about resilience, morality, and the human capacity for adaptation under extreme duress. Furthermore, Caleb's story challenges simplistic narratives of heroism and villainy. He is neither a conventional hero nor a straightforward villain. He is a human being responding rationally to irrational circumstance. His calculated violence was a response to systemic cruelty, and while it involved the taking of life, it was carried out with discernment and strategy, not impulse. The discomfort his story evokes is intentional. It reminds readers that oppression produces moral ambiguity, that survival often entails compromise, and that agency under duress can manifest in ways society may struggle to condone. In the broader context of history, Caleb's life illuminates the strategies and resilience of enslaved people who sought not merely to survive, but to assert control over their own lives. His story complements accounts of rebellion, escape, and everyday resistance, expanding our understanding of the varied ways individuals responded to oppression. Through careful observation, strategic planning, and the application of knowledge, he exemplifies a form of intellectual resistance that is often overshadowed by narratives emphasizing brute strength or collective revolt. Caleb demonstrates that resistance can be as subtle as it is powerful, as psychological as it is physical, and as personal as it is historical. The legacy of Caleb also invites reflection on contemporary forms of oppression. Across the world, individuals and communities continue to navigate systems that limit agency, enforce inequality, and demand moral compromise. Caleb's story provides a lens through which to understand the strategies, resilience, and ethical dilemmas that arise under such conditions. It reminds us that knowledge, vigilance, and calculated action are often necessary tools for survival, but that these tools come with significant emotional and moral consequences. His life serves as both inspiration and caution, a testament to human ingenuity and a warning about the costs of surviving under extreme oppression. As historians and descendants continue to study and reflect upon Caleb's life, his story remains deeply relevant. It encourages nuanced thinking about resistance, agency, and morality under oppression. It reminds us that acts of defiance can take forms we may not expect, that intelligence and patience can be as powerful as physical force, and that historical narratives must accommodate complexity rather than rely on simple binary. Caleb's life is a case study in resilience, strategy, and the moral challenges imposed by unjust systems, lessons that extend far beyond the cotton fields of Mississippi. The land that once bore witness to his flight and calculated vengeance has returned to wilderness. The Yazoo River continues its unbroken flow, carrying water over the land where Caleb's ingenuity and determination reshaped events forever. Yet the story of Caleb, the White Ghost, remains alive in historical records, journals, oral histories, and cultural memory. He is remembered not as a mythic figure, but as a real person, whose choices, intellect, and courage illuminate the extraordinary complexity of human life under oppression. Ultimately, Caleb's story is a meditation on the human condition under systemic injustice. It shows that oppression shapes behavior, morality, and identity in ways that are neither simple nor predictable. It challenges readers to consider the ethical and emotional costs of resistance, and to recognize the agency, intelligence, and courage that can manifest even in the most constrained circumstances. Caleb's life is a reminder that survival is not merely physical but intellectual, emotional, and moral, that resistance, however necessary, exacts a profound personal toll, and that the legacy of oppression echoes far beyond the immediate context of slavery, shaping generations and moral frameworks in ways both visible and hidden. In remembering Caleb, we remember the moral complexity of history, the resilience of the human spirit, and the high costs imposed by systems designed to dehumanize. We honor not just his survival but his intellect, his courage, and the ethical questions his life forces us to confront. The story of the White Ghost is a story of resistance, strategy, and the tragic consequences of oppression, a story that demands reflection,
challenges assumptions, and underscores the enduring impact of human ingenuity in the face of cruelty. Caleb, the albino slave who bled his master white in the cotton field, remains a figure of extraordinary human complexity, a man who turned knowledge into power, courage into strategy, and survival into both liberation and loss. His life invites us to consider not only the actions of the oppressed, but also the structures of oppression that compel such actions, and the moral ambiguities that persist when justice is denied. In the end, Caleb's story is not only about a single man in Mississippi, it is a meditation on oppression, resistance, and the profound human capacity to endure, adapt, and shape history against overwhelming odds. Even decades after his death, Caleb's story continued to reverberate in ways that transcended the local history of Warren County. In academic circles, his journal became a cornerstone for discussions about the intellectual agency of enslaved people, offering a perspective that had been systematically erased from mainstream narrative. In Black communities, the legend of the white ghost served as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of hope. It showed that resistance, when carefully considered and strategically executed, was possible even under the most oppressive conditions. Yet it also reminded future generations of the profound costs such resistance could exact on the human soul. Caleb's calculated acts of resistance challenged prevailing ideas about enslaved people as passive victims. His story illustrates that intellectual resistance, subtle manipulation, and patient observation were as critical to survival as physical strength or flight. He understood that creating fear among slaveholders did not require direct confrontation. It could be cultivated over time, leveraging knowledge, observation, and careful experimentation. The psychological dimension of his resistance, instilling uncertainty and dread, was revolutionary, transforming the power dynamics on plantations in ways that physical rebellion alone could not achieve. The broader implications of Caleb's life were equally profound. By demonstrating that enslaved individuals could possess expertise in pharmacology, medicine, and chemistry, Caleb disrupted assumptions that intellectual sophistication was the exclusive domain of the formally educated or free. His mastery of these sciences, learned initially from his mother and refined through self-directed study, exemplifies how marginalized people can transform limited resources into powerful tools of agency. Caleb's life challenges historians to reconsider how knowledge is transmitted, preserved, and wielded, especially under conditions designed to suppress learning and autonomy. Caleb's journal also served as a stark reminder of the ethical complexities inherent in acts of resistance. The meticulous planning and execution of Rutled's poisoning raises uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and human agency. Was Caleb's calculated violence justified in a society where conventional recourse was impossible? Could the ends, survival, and subtle deterrence of cruelty legitimately justify the means? Scholars continue to debate these questions, emphasizing that Caleb's life cannot be reduced to simple moral binary. He is neither hero nor villain, saint nor sinner. He exists in the gray space created by oppression, a space where survival and morality often collide in ways that defy easy judgment. This moral ambiguity extended into the ways Caleb navigated life after escape. In Canada, he found freedom but not community. He adopted anonymity as a shield, cultivating a life of quiet observation, occasional service, and continued learning. His work as an herbalist allowed him to apply his knowledge to heal others, yet he remained fundamentally isolated, his intellect and experience creating a barrier between himself and potential connection. Caleb's reflections in the journal reveal a persistent tension between survival and human connection. He had preserved his life, but at the cost of intimacy, trust, and emotional fulfillment. The journal repeatedly emphasizes that freedom in one sense does not automatically equate to wholeness or happiness. For modern readers, Caleb's story serves as both inspiration and warning. It demonstrates the capacity for human ingenuity and resilience under extreme adversity, while also highlighting the psychological and moral consequences of living under persistent oppression. His life invites reflection on contemporary forms of systemic injustice, situations in which individuals must navigate constraints, limited options, and moral compromises to protect themselves or their community. Caleb's choices remind us that resistance is rarely clean or uncomplicated. It is a negotiation between survival, ethics, and self-preservation.
Caleb's story also demonstrates the importance of documentation and evidence in preserving marginalized histories. Without his journal, much of what we know about his life would have been lost to folklore and fragmented memory. The journal offers a tangible record that bridges oral traditions and academic history, providing detailed insight into his methods, motivations, and reflections. It also validates the experiences of countless enslaved individuals whose intelligence, agency, and strategic thinking was systematically erased or dismissed. Caleb's life reminds us that marginalized voices, when preserved and interpreted carefully, can reshape our understanding of history and human potential. In addition to its academic significance, Caleb's story has social and cultural resonance. The white ghost of Warren County became a symbol of resistance in local communities, inspiring pride, caution, and reflection. Descendants of enslaved people drew strength from his intellect and courage, viewing him as proof that even under extreme oppression, individuals could assert agency and influence outcome. At the same time, the legend served as a reminder of the risks and costs associated with resistance, emphasizing that survival and moral compromise were often inseparable. Caleb's life also challenges assumptions about race, appearance, and identity in historical context. As an albino man with European features, he occupied a liminal space within both black and white communities. This duality shaped his experiences and strategies, forcing him to navigate suspicion, fear, and prejudice from multiple directions. His mother's advice to turn difference into strength became central to his survival strategy. Caleb's ability to leverage his unique identity, coupled with his exceptional intellect, underscores the complex interplay between biology, social perception, and power in historical and contemporary context. The final lesson of Caleb's story is perhaps the most profound: resistance is neither simple nor cost-free, and those who survive often carry burdens invisible to the broader world. Caleb's intellect allowed him to evade death, manipulate power, and achieve a form of liberation. Yet in doing so, he sacrificed elements of his humanity, enduring isolation, moral ambiguity, and the psychological weight of premeditated violence. His story is a testament to the duality of resistance, the empowerment it provides, and the personal toll it exacts. Today, scholars, educators, and storytellers continue to draw lessons from Caleb's life. His story challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about historical agency, the ethics of resistance, and the capacity of oppressed individuals to navigate complex moral and strategic landscapes. It reminds us that the narratives of history are incomplete without attention to those who resisted in ways that were intellectual, strategic, and morally ambiguous. Caleb's legacy endures in the ethical debates he inspires, the folklore he populates, and the historical record he helps preserve. Ultimately, Caleb's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths: that oppression dehumanizes both the oppressed and the oppressors, that knowledge can be wielded as both a tool and a weapon, and that moral clarity is often elusive in contexts of systemic injustice. His story, simultaneously inspiring and troubling, invites reflection on the enduring consequences of slavery, the complexities of resistance, and the ways individuals navigate power, survival, and morality under extreme conditions. Caleb, the white ghost of Warren County, remains both a historical figure and a symbol of courage, of intellect, and of the moral ambiguities inherent in human survival under tyranny. The story of Caleb did not end with the last pages of his journal or with the fading whispers of local folklore. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, his life has continued to provoke reflection, debate, and scholarship, illustrating the enduring resonance of his experience. Modern historians, educators, descendants of enslaved people, and cultural commentators all grapple with the complex legacy of the white ghost of Warren County. Caleb's life, long obscured by the anonymity he cultivated, now serves as both a case study in resistance and a mirror reflecting the ethical dilemmas created by systemic oppression. One of the earliest signs of Caleb's modern impact emerged after the 1950 publication of his journal. The Historical Society's annotated edition not only made his story accessible to scholars, but also provoked controversy. In the South, where memories of slavery were still deeply embedded in local identity, many white residents found the journal unsettling. Newspapers reported heated debates. Some argued that publishing Caleb's account glorified murder and could inflame racial tensions, while others contended that it offered an invaluable corrective to sanitized histories of slavery. These debates underscored the power of narrative and the discomfort that arises when history challenges entrenched myths of passivity, obedience, and moral simplicity. For scholars of slavery and African American history, Caleb's journal became a touchstone for understanding the nuanced forms of resistance available to enslaved individuals. Unlike revolts that relied on overt violence or escape attempts that required coordinated networks, Caleb's approach combined intellect, strategy, and patience. He leveraged knowledge of pharmacology, human physiology, and social dynamics
to achieve goals that brute force alone could not accomplish. His life demonstrates that resistance under slavery was not only physical but cognitive, requiring foresight, experimentation, and careful observation. Researchers highlighted the sophisticated application of toxicology described in his writings, noting that Caleb's methods reflected principles understood by trained scientists, even if he had no formal education. The moral complexity of Caleb's actions continued to generate discussion in academic and public forums. Some scholars framed him as a freedom fighter, arguing that his use of violence was justified by the systemic brutality and dehumanization he endured. Others emphasized the ethical ambiguity of his choices, noting that the deliberate killing of individuals, regardless of their cruelty, introduces questions about the moral limits of resistance. Ethical debates about Caleb's actions intersected with broader questions about historical judgment. Can modern moral frameworks be fairly applied to societies in which enslaved people had no legal protection, no recourse, and no recognized personhood? Caleb's story remains central to these discussions precisely because it refuses to provide simple answers. The story of the White Ghost also inspired a generation of African American writers, educators, and artists who sought to reclaim the agency of enslaved people from narratives that cast them solely as victims. In literature, Caleb became a symbol of the intellectual and strategic capacities of those forced into bondage. Novels, short stories, and plays drew on his life, blending historical fact with speculative interpretation to explore themes of revenge, survival, and moral compromise. In classrooms, his journal and the surrounding scholarship offered students an opportunity to analyze resistance, not as a monolithic concept, but as a spectrum of strategies shaped by circumstance, risk, and knowledge. Caleb's legacy is also visible in the ways communities have engaged with the physical spaces associated with his life. The small marker erected by the Warren County Historical Society in 1998 serves as a reminder of both the man and the complexity of the history he inhabits. The marker does not name Caleb, reflecting ongoing sensitivities about commemorating acts of violence, but it acknowledges the disputed circumstances of Nathaniel Rutled's death and the broader history of the plantation. Local historians and civil rights groups have organized tours, lectures, and educational programs around the marker, emphasizing Caleb's story as a means of understanding the moral and historical dimensions of slavery. Visitors are encouraged to grapple with the uncomfortable truths of oppression, resistance, and the human cost of survival. Descendants of enslaved people have played a critical role in keeping Caleb's story alive. Oral histories collected in the 1950s and 1960s, combined with later genealogical research, demonstrate that the tale of the White Ghost was transmitted across generations, often in coded or fragmentary form. Families preserved memories of cleverness, courage, and subtle rebellion, passing them down alongside other cultural traditions. For many descendants, Caleb is both a historical figure and a symbol of resilience, embodying the intelligence and agency of ancestors whose stories might otherwise have been lost. These intergenerational narratives remind us that history is not only recorded in journals and official documents, but also in the collective memory and lived experience of communities. Caleb's story has also influenced modern discussions about justice and resistance under extreme oppression. Scholars of ethics, sociology, and law have cited his life as a case study in situations where conventional systems failed to protect the vulnerable. His calculated approach to survival raises questions about the limits of legal and moral authority, the ethics of preemptive action against systemic harm, and the ways knowledge can serve as both a shield and a weapon. In contemporary contexts, parallels are drawn to oppressed populations worldwide who face choices between compliance, flight, or calculated resistance in the face of violence and injustice. Caleb's life challenges us to think critically about the structural conditions that force individuals into morally ambiguous decisions. In addition to academic study, Caleb has inspired artistic reinterpretation. Historians and creatives alike have explored his story through visual art, theater, and film. Paintings and illustrations depict the White Ghost in spectral and naturalistic forms, often emphasizing the tension between his albino appearance and his human agent. Theater productions dramatize his moral and psychological struggles, presenting audiences with the ethical dilemmas he faced. In film, the blending of historical realism with elements of suspense or horror highlights both the factual basis of his actions and the almost mythical qualities that folklore has attributed to. These artistic interpretations serve not only as entertainment, but also as vehicles for reflection on morality, oppression, and human resilience. Yet, even as Caleb's story has entered popular consciousness, Historians caution against oversimplification. He is neither a one-dimensional hero nor a pure villain. He is a human being shaped by extraordinary circumstances. His intelligence, patience, and courage are undeniable, but so too are the moral compromises and psychological burdens he endured. Scholars emphasize that the true lesson of his life lies not in admiration or condemnation, but in understanding the complex realities of resistance under oppression. Caleb's story encourages a nuanced appreciation for the strategies enslaved people employed, the moral and emotional costs of survival, and the long-lasting consequences of systemic injustice. In recent years, Caleb's life has been revisited in the context of broader discussions about historical memory and reconciliation. Efforts to recognize and memorialize the contributions and struggles of enslaved individuals often reference his story as a potent example of resistance and agency. Civil rights organizations and educational programs use his narrative to challenge simplified historical accounts, promoting a more complete understanding of slavery's human consequence. The lessons drawn from Caleb's life continue to resonate, emphasizing the enduring importance of historical knowledge, ethical reflection, and cultural memory. Caleb's influence also extends to discussions of race, identity, and perception. His albino appearance set him apart within both black and white communities, shaping the strategies he employed and the way others perceived him. By turning difference into a form of power, he demonstrated that identity can be both a challenge and a tool, a source of vulnerability and a catalyst for agency. Modern discussions of intersectionality and social perception often reference Caleb as an example of how individuals navigate complex social hierarchies, leveraging unique attributes to survive and influence outcomes. Ultimately, Caleb's story is a reminder that history is rarely simple. It contains ambiguity, moral complexity, and lessons that challenge our assumptions. The White Ghost of Warren County exemplifies the interplay between oppression and resistance, intelligence and violence, survival and moral compromise. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human capacity for both calculated action and ethical reflection. He reminds us that resistance can take many forms, that knowledge is a powerful tool, and that the consequences of systemic injustice extend far beyond the immediate moment. As Caleb's tale continues to be studied, debated, and retold, it serves as both a warning and a guide. It warns of the profound costs of oppression, illustrating how systems of cruelty can shape individuals in ways that leave lasting psychological and moral scars. At the same time, it guides contemporary reflection on agency, resilience, and ethical action in contexts where oppression persists. Caleb's life demonstrates that human beings possess the capacity for extraordinary foresight, intellect, and courage, even under extreme duress, and that these qualities can alter the course of history in ways both subtle and dramatic. In the end, Caleb remains both an historical figure and a symbol. He is a man who survived the most brutal system ever devised to dehumanize, a thinker who transformed knowledge into power, and a human being who bore the consequences of resistance with extraordinary patience and foresight. His story endures because it refuses to be simple. It challenges us to consider the moral and practical complexities of survival under oppression, the costs of resistance, and the ways in which history, memory, and legacy intertwine. Caleb, the White Ghost of Warren County, remains with us, not as a legend or a ghost, but as a testament to the profound human capacity for resistance, intelligence, and moral reflection in the face of unimaginable cruelty.